Hi, everyone. Good afternoon from New York. I'm Dr. Dennis Melendez, Program Director with the GSMI, Program Director at Cientifico Latino. And this is a GSMI alumni webinar um, on, um, oh, wait, hold on. Sorry. Breaking down careers in science policy. So today we have Monserrat Orozco, who is a PhD candidate in the biomedical sciences graduate program at the University of New Mexico, specializing in neuroscience. Her research focuses on how high intensity drinking affects different cell types in the brain's reward system by studying molecular and electrophysiological changes in the nucleus accumbens and how these changes impact motivation and behaviors associated with excessive alcohol consumption. She's passionate about science communication and advocacy. Monserrat has led community engagement initiatives and participated in national science policy programs to help reduce the stigma associated with substance use disorders. And so, with that, I'd like you just to please ask questions. Feel free to ask questions whenever you want in the meeting chat or in the Q&A panel, um, and we will do our best to get to them at the end. Um, and thank you so much for being here. We're very happy to have you, Montserrat. Please feel free to share your screen and get started. So right now, you are muted, but the screen is okay. There, we have the full screen now.
Cool. There you go. Okay, so it's just my screen then. All right, cool. Thank you. I can go ahead and get started. Yeah, so hi everyone. Good morning, afternoon. For me, it's still morning. Thank you once again, Cientifico Latino, for inviting me to present more on science policy and what it entails. So, as Dennis mentioned, I'm Monserrat Orozco, but I go by Monse, and I'm in the Neurosciences Department at University of New Mexico Health Science Center, and I'm a fifth year PhD student. So for today, just a little small outline. I'll be doing a little small introduction about myself, to just introduce how I got to where I'm at right now and different things that I went through to get to where I'm at right now in the context of like science policy. Also explain a little bit what science policy is and follow up with why scientific voices matter in the science policy sector, as well as how to get started and some opportunities that are available for like trainees. Because I know when I was starting, first I didn't know how to start, and also like what opportunities there were. And I will also share some skills gained and some of the challenges and lessons that I learned from these experiences. And then at the end, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to ask them. So I'm originally from Anaheim, California. Most people recognize it because of Disneyland, which is the happiest place on earth. But the Anaheim I grew up in looked very different from this image, where we're seeing Mickey Mouse, the castle, all those characters. But I grew up in a low socioeconomic community where a lot of the access to resources were limited, and there was a lot of high crime rates and drug trafficking where that were part of my everyday life. So growing up in this environment made me curious about how the brain works and what drives certain behavior. I started to become more interested in neuroscience as a way to understand those questions at a deeper level. And at the same time, it also made me aware that understanding science on its own isn't just enough. Whether people actually get support often depends on access to education, community resources, and the policies that shape those systems. And that's what eventually led me to become interested in science policy and how scientific knowledge can actually be translated into decisions that impact communities in a meaningful way. So during my undergraduate studies at California State University, Los Angeles, I majored in biochemistry with a minor in criminal justice, while also staying interested in how biological mechanisms connect behavior and the criminal justice system. At my undergraduate institution, there were very limited opportunities in neuroscience research, so I initially worked in plant science. one day I showed up to a seminar where new faculty were talking about their research and recruiting students. And that's where I found my undergrad research mentor. We talked about what she had presented and asked me if I was joining or I was interested in joining her lab, and I said yes. At the same time, I was also volunteering with a nonprofit organization called the Prison Education Project. There, I worked with incarcerated individuals who were preparing to reintegrate into society, um, many of whom had a substance use disorder. In this program here, or with this organization, I was able to do GED tutoring and facilitated an introduction to college series. So that experience made it clear to me that the questions I was interested in extended far beyond my immediate academic environment and lived experiences in my community. So I opted in to seek opportunities in neuroscience research. So I ended up applying to the University of Southern California's Neuroscience Neural Undergraduate Research and Learning Program. This is where I gained my first formal exposure to neuroscience research. However, I was already entering my senior year at that point, and I still didn't fully understand what a PhD path looked like or how to apply. I just knew that I liked asking questions and coming up with, hypotheses and following up with experimental designs and how to answer these questions. So around that time, I attended SACNAS, where I learned about postbaccalaureate research programs. I decided to apply because I wanted more direct experience in neuroscience, specifically in addiction-related research, as well as guidance to apply for graduate school and professional development opportunities. I was accepted into Indiana University's Indianapolis, at Indianapolis program, postbaccalaureate program, where I studied how developmental lead exposure altered locomotor behavior in response to morphine. That was a pivotal point for me because it was my first real exposure to addiction neuroscience, preclinically. So during that experience, I realized I wanted to continue focusing on the neurobiology of addiction and also think more about how this research could be connected back to communities and used to reduce stigma and inform policy. Also, shout out to Cientifico Latino and their mentorship program. I went through that when I was applying to graduate school, and they're just amazing. So I just wanted to give them a shout out. So from there, I applied to graduate school and eventually joined where I'm at right now, the Biomedical Sciences graduate program in the Neurosciences department at the University of New Mexico, where I'm now a fifth-year PhD candidate. My current research examines how high-intensity drinking alters molecular and electrophysiological plasticity in the brain region nucleus accumbens. But the main focus is looking at the changes in a protein-protein interaction, which is GSK3 beta and NaV1.6 that affect neuronal excitability and behavior. At the beginning of my PhD training, I was very focused on developing as a neuroscientist and building a strong research foundation, going through the first year curricula, acclimating into a new research field, etc. But at the same time, I started to realize that I was still trying to fully understand what science policy and advocacy actually meant beyond just hearing the terms in academic or professional spaces. When I was applying to graduate school and when I got asked what I wanted to do with my PhD once I obtained it, I would bring up science policy, and, tying it back to the field of interest, addiction, and, advocate for the population. So I knew I was interested in the idea that science connects to the decision making and having a broader societal impact, but I didn't yet have a clear sense of what that looked like in practice or how people actually worked in that space from day to day. So during that early part of graduate school, I started to slowly explore how science policy and advocacy fit into the broader scientific ecosystem and what it means to move between research and those more applied spaces. So for example, science policy is essentially the space where scientific evidence is used to inform and guide policy decisions. So instead of science only being used in academic or research settings, it becomes part of the decision-making process that shapes how resources are allocated, what priorities are set, and how systems are structured. One way this shows up is through evaluating and shaping policies that affect research and innovation. This can include things like how funding agencies decide which areas of research to prioritize, what kinds of grants get supported, or how regulations impact the ability to conduct research. For example, like the NIH or NSF don't just fund science, randomly. They rely on review processes, strategic priorities, and input from scientists and policy experts to really decide where investment will have the most impact. It also plays a role in advising decision makers on broader priorities. For example, like funding allocations, workforce development, and the long-term scientific goals in the field. This can involve providing evidence to help guide questions like what areas of biomedical research should be expanded? How do we support training the next generation of scientists? Or how do we ensure that scientific advances actually translate into the public benefit? So a lot of this work happens through federal agencies, advisory committees, and legislative offices where the scientific information is translated into language that can inform decisions. So it's not just about generating the data, but also interpreting and what the data means in the context of real-world constraints, priorities, and the societal needs. So overall, policy is the bridge between the scientific knowledge and the systems that determine how that knowledge is used, supported, and implemented. Science advocacy focuses more on the communicating the value of science to both the public and policymakers. So while science policy is often about how decisions are made within systems, advocacy is more about making sure those systems understand why science matters in the first place. So a big part of this involves communicating why investment in research, education, and evidence-based initiatives is important. So this can look like explaining how scientific research connects to public health outcomes, economic development, or community well-being in the research that you are doing or you're interested in doing. But it can also highlight why sustained funding is necessary for long-term progress, even when the scientific outcomes do take time to develop. So advocacy plays a role in promoting support for science at multiple levels, which include federal agencies, local institutions, and community organizations. So this can involve engaging with policymakers directly or their legislative staff, participating in advocacy days, or contributing to discussions that help shape science in a perceived and prioritized in public decision making. Another component of advocacy is building partnership and awareness. This can include like collaborations with other scientists, educators, professional societies, and community organizations to make science more accessible and relevant. It also includes broader efforts to improve the public understanding of science, especially in areas where there may be misinformation or limited access to scientific resources and knowledge. So overall, advocacy is about strengthening that connection between science and society to make sure that scientific knowledge is not only generated, but also understood, valued, supported by the communities and system it ultimately serves. This overlap between science policy and advocacy is where things start to come together in practice because they both ensure that policies are informed by scientific evidence, which means that decisions are not just being made in isolation from what research actually shows. And at the same time, it also creates pathways for scientists to have a voice in shaping how research is supported and how science ultimately impacts society. In this space, scientists are participating in conversations about how evidence is interpreted, communicated, and also used. So that can include providing input on funding priorities, research directions, or broader societal needs that science can help address. With this overlap, it also reflects the fact that communication and engagement are not separate from policy work. They're a part of how the science becomes actionable. So whether that is translating research for non-scientific audiences, engaging with the community that your research focuses on or targets, or contributing to policy discussions. So these activities all help strengthen how science is understood and supported. So this space is really about the integration of the scientific evidence, the communication and engagement in a way that is strengthening both the scientific enterprise, as well as connecting to society. So now that we've talked a little bit about how science policy and advocacy overlap, it helps to zoom out and look at where a lot of these actually happen. So this happens, science policy is shaped across the three branches of government. So this isn't meant to be a full Civics 101 breakdown or class of how the government works. It's just a general overview to give some context of how science policy is structured because it is very complex. It is very long, but it is not the purpose of this webinar. So I'm just going to briefly cover certain points that relate to science policy and advocacy. So with that being said, the first, we have the legislative branch, which is responsible for making laws. So this includes Congress, which is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate. This is where the laws are written and federal budgets are decided. So when we think about things like funding for NIH or NSF, or just national decisions and how they're shaped through committees, hearings, and the work of staff and advisors behind the scenes. And then next, we have the executive branch, which carries out the laws. This includes the president, the vice president, and the cabinet, along with other federal agencies. Agencies like the Department of Energy, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Environmental Protection Agency, NASA, NSF, take laws passed by Congress and translate them into programs such as grant funding, research initiatives, regulations, and national priorities. This is where a lot of the science policy gets turned into action and where many of the day-to-day activities happen, for example, through program officers, analysts, and scientific advisors. And then there is the judicial branch, which includes the Supreme Court and federal courts and other federal courts. They play a less direct role in the day-to-day science policy, but they become very important when laws or policies are challenged or need to be interpreted. For example, if there's a disagreement about how a federal policy should be implemented, the courts may step in to clarify what is legally allowed. So that interpretation can affect how the policy is carried out across agencies, universities, and research institutions. For example, like last year, indirect costs, cutting funds for DI programs and stuff like that. They were carried out to the judicial. So as we can see, when you zoom out, science policy is not located in one office or in one building. It is distributed across these three branches, and each one plays a different role in how decisions move from ideas to laws to implementation. So science policy shows up across many different roles too in government, research, and organizations that connect to these systems. And policy is shaped by multiple groups across government, research and industry, and policy organization, as I was mentioning earlier. So for example, we have the federal government, which plays a major role in setting national priorities. With that, Congress is responsible for authorizing and funding research, as well as passing legislation that determines how policies are structured. In addition, the White House also helps broader national priorities and agendas that influence what gets prioritized on the federal at the federal level. And supporting these systems are two key offices. The first one is the Office of Management and Budget, which helps determine how federal funding is distributed across agencies, while the Office of Science and Technology Policy provides scientific and technical input to guide those national decision-making policies. So they help translate priorities into funding decisions and the policy direction. And then we also have state governments. They play an important role, especially, for example, like in public health, education, and environmental policy. States often implement federal policies, but they can also develop their own approaches based on the local needs and priorities that their community is wanting or are needing. Another major influence comes from funding agencies, for example, like the NIH, NASA, NSF. So these agencies don't just distribute the funding, they also help shape research priorities by deciding what areas of science receive support, which ultimately influences the direction of that scientific discovery and innovation. And there's academia, including universities and research institutions, which generate much of the evidence that informs policy. We do the research. This is where a large portion of scientific research is conducted and where data and findings are produced that feed directly into the policy discussions. And then we also have the private sector and industry, which includes biotechnology and other science-driven companies that play a role. Uh, they're mostly involved in translating research into like application, and they can also influence areas like innovation, technology development, and other regulations. And then there's also organizations that help connect science and policy. Um, for example, like think think tanks. That's a cluster, that a phrasing that I always like stutter on. But they help synthesize research and provide policy recommendations. There's also nonprofits where they often focus on special or specific societal issues and advocacy that help bring attention to particular needs of a specific population or community that they're serving. And these groups help translate that into a more accessible information for decision makers. And then there are professional, like, again, the last would be like professional societies, which bring together experts from different fields and often develop consensus, the statements or policy recommendation based off of the collective scientific expertise. So again, it's not shaped by just one place or by one group. It takes a lot of the interaction between the different groups to contribute to that expertise and perspective to influence how the decisions are made. So when people think of policy issues, whether in government, research, or advocacy, there are a few key questions that naturally guide how a problem is thought through and eventually turn into a solution. So first, we start by defining the problem. So this means asking, what issue are we trying to address? Why does it matter? And what evidence already exists? This step is really important because how a problem is defined often determines what kind of solution gets developed. For example, if we look in public health, we might look at like, for example, for my stuff that I've done, it's like substance use trends or disease outcomes. So while the environmental policy, it could involve air or environmental policies, it could involve like air quality, climate exposure, or ecosystem health. So defining the problem ensures that the policy is grounded in evidence rather than assumptions. So then we want to consider who is involved. So policy doesn't just happen in isolation, so it's very important to identify stakeholders, like who is affected by the issue and who is involved in the decision making. This can include federal and state agencies, researchers, community organizations, and advocacy groups, depending on the topic that you are interested in or you're trying to tackle down. So thinking about the stakeholders early helps make sure that the policy is relevant and actually reflects the population it is intended to serve. From there, we want to think about the goal of the policy. This step is about defining what success looks like. So sometimes the goal is reducing harm, sometimes it's improving access to resources or addressing disparities at a systems level. So being clear about the goal is important because it guides every decision that follows from design all the way to implementation. And then that's where the implementation comes in, or how the policy would actually be carried out in practice. So this includes thinking about what steps are needed to get there, what resources are required, and what barriers might come up along the way. Because even a well-designed policy can fail, and if there's not enough infrastructure or coordination to support it, then it won't work out. So this is also where an important question comes in. How would it be monitored and evaluated over time to determine whether it is working as intended? So monitoring allows for adjustments based off on data rather than assuming a policy is effective just from the start. And then finally, we do want to consider the impact, both short-term and long-term. So this involves thinking about what outcomes we expect to see, who is affected, and whether the policy is actually achieving its intended goal over time. This is where evaluation becomes very critical because policies often have unintended consequences and you don't really see them until the implementation begins in because you have different factors that you might have not considered at the beginning or it's not going as expected. So just thinking these through is very important. So these questions provide a framework for moving from identifying a problem to developing and assessing solutions. They also highlight how scientific expertise can be integrated throughout the process, just from defining the issue to evaluating outcomes, to make sure that the policy decisions are grounded in evidence-based research at every single step. Here are just some examples. To start off, For example, starting off with the substance use in rural communities. So that'd be like the area of interest, right? So the first step is really how the problem is defined. So in this case, we're not only talking about substance use rates overall, but also differences in access to care. So rural communities often face additional barriers like limited treatment facilities, fewer providers trained in addiction medicine, and longer travel distances for care. So the problem is not just the substance use itself, but the combination of substance use and the unequal access to evidence-based treatment. From there, the policy goal becomes more specific. It is not only about reducing substance use, but again, reducing overdose deaths, improving the access to medication, for example, for an opioid use disorder, and expanding harm reduction strategies that are actually accessible in these communities short term and long term. So when we think about the policy, this is where things like expanding treatment infrastructure, increasing funding for rural health programs, and supporting medication assisted treatment become very important and starting to think about where and how we can do this. So these are the types of decisions that translate the evidence, for example, in the addiction neuroscience and public health into like real world problems. And then the impact we're trying to achieve is, again, not just short-term changes, but long-term changes and how we can do that long-term wise. Another example where this same framework applies is, for example, environmental health and climate exposure. Here, the problem is defined around how environmental conditions like air quality emissions and climate-related exposures directly impact health at a population level. This is not just about population in general, but about how these exposures translate into real outcomes like respiratory diseases, cardiovascular risk, and other long-term health effects. So it can also include thinking about which communities are most affected and how exposure is not evenly distributed. So from there, the goal of the policy is typically to reduce harmful exposures and improve population health outcomes. That can be, for example, reducing emissions, improving air quality standards, and developing strategies that help communities adapt to climate-related risks over time. So when we think about policy actions, this is where things like air quality regulations, emission standards, and climate adaptation policies come in place. These are often informed by scientific evidence that connect environmental exposure and see the health outcomes and what it's required for coordination across the different levels of government and regulatory agencies for the population to not be at risk anymore. And then finally, the impact is seen at the population level, so that through reduced population-related diseases, so improved environmental conditions, and long-term improvements as public health in general. So in many cases, these policies also have broader effects that just go beyond the health. So that could also include like economic and infrastructure-related outcomes. So looking across these examples, you can start to see how much policy depends on how evidence is interpreted and applied, which is why scientific voices play such an important role in this space. This role extends beyond generating data and into how that evidence is communicated, contextualized, and used in decision making. So ultimately, this highlights why scientific voices matter in policy, because scientific expertise is essential for ensuring that decisions are grounded in evidence and accurately reflect what the research shows. So first, science helps shape research priorities and scientific progress by identifying the areas where evidence is needed and where investment can have the greatest impact. It also helps influence policies that both impact science and society. So whether that is through funding decisions, public health approaches, or education and workforce development, it could be there. And it supports evidence-based decisions by ensuring that the policies are grounded in data rather than assumptions. So we are the experts, we are collecting the data, and we are disseminating that, whether that's through publication or like science communication, like at conferences, etc. So from there, a key part of science policy is connecting science to society. So this involves translating scientific research into accessible information for policymakers and the public so that complex findings can be understood and used in decision-making spaces. It also helps improve understanding of the complex scientific issues that there are within those spaces to ensure that they're interpreted correctly and they're meaningful since we are the experts in the field. So it's about bridging the gap between evidence and that science policy action. Another important component is how scientists engage with policy spaces. So this includes building connections across scientists, policymakers, and broader just community to help strengthen that communication to create more effective working relationships across different sectors. It also helps increase representation and participation across different career stages so that a wider range of perspectives are included in policy discussions and during the decision-making processes. So across all these areas, what I've realized is that science is not just a separate part of science, but an extension of it. Is where evidence is interpreted, communicated, and applied, and where scientific voices help ensure that decisions are informed and grounded in research based off of what we do and the hard work that we do. So understanding why policy matters also helped me think about how to get involved. So I'll just talk a little bit about my involvement with science policy and advocacy. So my first experience was with the Society for Neuroscience Early Career Policy Ambassador Program back in 2023. I remember when I was applying, I felt like I was not qualified enough because I didn't have that technical experience. But I talked, but when I was applying, I talked about the work I had done in my undergrad with the incarcerated population and where I can see policies going. It was a little nerve-wracking because I also didn't know if my research mentor would be okay with me applying to the program. I just remember walking back and forth outside his office, preparing a speech on why I wanted to apply and how it would help me in the long run. It reminded me when I was a child and wanted to ask my mom for permission to go out with my friends, and I would stand outside her door and prepare a speech. But when I talked to him, he was on board and even helped me with the application and provided feedback because he wanted me to get that experience since he didn't know much about science policy in the advocacy sector. So this program introduces early career scientists to science policy and advocacy by providing exposure to how scientific evidence connects to decision making and public engagement. So, as being an ambassador, we took range of activities, including meetings with congressional offices, science communication with other researchers, and public outreach efforts. With different events, presentations, and advocacy related activities. For me, this program was an important first step in seeing how science communication and policy engagement came together in practice and how scientists can participate in spaces that extend beyond academia. I had the opportunity to engage in a few activities that focused on science communication and outreach. One activity involved disseminating information to colleagues about substance use disorder within incarcerated populations. This was focused on increasing awareness of how substance use intersects with the criminal justice system and how evidence-based approaches can inform discussions around treatment and reentry. Another activity that I focused on doing while I was a ECPA was focusing on increasing diverse representation for the New Mexico Brain Bee. So pretty much it's like a spelling bee, but with neuroscience facts where high school students compete. This involved helping high schools get funding for transportation and participate in the event from rural areas with the goal to expand access to neuroscience education opportunities across the state. But additionally, from these activities, I also participated in SFN's 2023 Hill Day. So Hill Day is an advocacy experience where SFN connects participants with legislative staff in their home states to discuss key issues in neuroscience research. So during these meetings, here's a picture with SFN staff that helped guide the conversation as well as someone from the office. So during these meetings, we advocated for support of robust and consistent investment in neuroscience research, also support for ethical and well-regulated animal research, opportunities for engagement such as lab tours, like at my institution, University of New Mexico, and participation in congressional neuroscience focused caucuses. So for me, this experience provided a clear example of how scientists can directly communicate priorities to policymakers and participate in discussions that influence the funding and scientific direction. In addition to the SFN ECPA program, I was also participating in the Federation of American Scientists and the Next 100 Science Policy and Equity Accelerator. So this program focused on integrating science policy with equity-centered approaches and how policy decisions can better reflect diverse communities and lived experiences. So through the accelerator, I participated in structured discussions and training focused on how science policy is developed, how equity considerations can be incorporated into policy design and communication. A major emphasis was also how different communities are impacted by policy decisions in very different ways and why representation in these spaces is important. As part of this experience, I wrote a policy memo focused on expanding healthcare coverage for incarcerated populations to help reduce opioid-related relapses, overdose, and recidivism after release and provide recommendations to tackle the problem. This memo, I received a lot of help because I didn't know what a policy memo was. And they helped me guide and synthesize scientific evidence and translated it into a format that could be useful for policy decision making. So this experience helped me in general or understand how evidence-based approaches are used in these spaces and how scientific information can be communicated in ways that are directly relevant to the real world decision making. So this just reinforced the idea that science policy is not only about evidence and decisions, but also who is represented in those processes and how inclusive those systems are and how important they are. So after finishing these programs, I ran into this certificate program. UCI was offering it. I believe they're still offering it. It's a UCI GPS Science Policy and Advocacy Certificate program. So when I was going through this program, I wish that I would have started with this first because I feel like I started backwards. Pretty much this was like, I believe it was like a semester long, once per week. They covered again what science policy was, who were the different people involved, like what a policy memo was, what an op-ed was. Like it was like very like formational, or like it gave a lot of context of to what it was. So I definitely recommend it. Um, Again, I feel like I started backwards, so um, I would definitely look into this right here. So following with these experiences, I felt like I had a little bit more experience. So I ended up participating in a competitive opportunity through the university's research association, which was the Science Policy and Advocacy for Research competition. So this was a policy-focused competition that brought together individuals with a prior experience in science policy to develop and present ideas related to science and research opportunities or priorities. So as part of the experience, we worked on developing policy pitches and received guidance from experts who helped train us on how to effectively present these ideas to legislative staff. This included refining how we communicate scientific and policy concepts in a way that was clear, concise, and relevant for decision making in the audiences. We also we also had to like provide a pitch, and I wrote an op-ed, which is a public-facing opinion piece that translates science policy ideas for a general audience. So this helped me think more intentionally about how to communicate scientific issues outside that formal policy space. And this experience provided exposure to how science policy is evaluated and communicated in more formal settings and how different perspectives are considered when you think about research direction, the funding priorities, and scientific impact. For me, it was another step in strengthening how I approach science communication in the context of policy and learn about other policies from my peers as well. Another experience that expanded my understanding was the AAAS case workshop. This was a 3-day intensive workshop that brought together graduate students and early career scientists from across the country to learn more about how science and federal policy intersect in practice. So I would definitely recommend this experience as well because it provided a much deeper understanding of how policy decisions are made at the federal level and how scientists can effectively engage in those conversations. Throughout the workshop, we learned about the structure and organization of Congress, the federal budget, appropriation processes, and how federal funding decisions directly influence scientific research and the workforce development and innovation. So, a major focus was also placed on science communication and civic engagement, particularly how to communicate scientific ideas clearly and effectively to policymakers and non-scientific audiences. Just because like this workshop was very interactive, it had seminars and advocacy training sessions where we practiced how to frame scientific issues in ways that um, were brought up in discussion. Involved learning how to develop concise talking points, communicate the broader societal impact, and adapt scientific language for legislative audiences. Just because at the end of the workshop, you met with your legislative staff at Capitol Hill. So one of the most important parts of the workshop was, again, at the end when participants met with legislative staff from their home states to discuss policy priorities and advocacy issues. When I participated, these meetings were held virtual, and then now being in DC gave the opportunity to talk to them in person. So during these meetings, again, I was focusing, when we were all brainstorming and like what priorities or things we can bring up. One of the main things that were brought up were the increase in federal funding. Again, I attended last year, so that was a big, and it still is a major problem. But also, I wanted to focus on international students and the importance of creating supportive environments for trainees and researchers within like the state of New Mexico. So that conversation really highlighted how science policy extends beyond the research itself and also includes the broader systems and policies that shape the scientific workforce and research environment. So this research gave me much clearer understanding of how advocacy operates at the federal level and how scientists can participate directly in the conversations that influence research funding, education, and policy priorities. So building off of these experiences, they served as a stepping stone for me to become involved with the Research Society on Alcohol's advocacy efforts. Previously I had applied for the committee but I never heard back. But it wasn't until a member of the committee reached out to me and told me to apply again, and they put in a good word and finally got in. So within their RSA, I've had the opportunity to contribute, for example, like giving the grad school perspective through panel discussions where I've shared insights into navigating pathways into science policy and advocacy as an early career researcher. I've also co-led workshops with peers focused on how graduate students can get involved in this sector and what those entry points can look like across different stages of training. Additionally, I'm currently working on updating policy white papers, which are concise, evidence-based documents that help synthesize scientific literature on a specific topic for society members, even policymakers, if they want to look at it in advocacy efforts. So in this case, the focus that what I'm focusing on is animal research and preclinical alcohol research, with the goal of providing accessible evidence based off of summaries that RSA members can use when engaging in advocacy committees, for example, Hill Day participation. So this has allowed me to continue building on those earlier policy trainings that I've had into now. Also, I explored opportunities to strengthen how science communication can be seen in media platforms. So this led me to participate in the Science Careers and Opportunities in Policy and Education program, where I focus on engaging with science policy through traditional new media. So I came across this program on LinkedIn and decided to try it out because, the new media component stood out to me and felt like it was an interesting way to expand my science communications. However, as I went through the program, I realized that while I was interested in the science communication broadly, speaking on camera and recording myself was not the format I was most comfortable with and did not like it. But I would still recommend this program to anyone interested in science communication through, media or public-facing policy engagement, especially if you enjoy video-based communication. TikTok, Instagram are very popular. So this program really focused on how to communicate scientific and policy-related topics to different audiences and how to tailor those messages depending on the platform and audience being reached. Since I preferred the written communication, I chose to develop a newspaper style piece and also create a one pager. So, one pager is a concise single page document designed to summarize a scientific or policy topic in a clear and accessible way. It helps highlight key evidence, main takeaways, and broader implications in a format that can be quickly understood by people who are not in this specialized sector. So in the program, we develop on a project where we can choose how to communicate a science policy topic through different media formats. Some participants created short video content, such as TikTok style videos, to explain their research issues. Others develop podcast concepts where they outline potential topics and guests they would invite to talk about the issue or talk about the topic that they were interested in. So others also use projects that use animation or visual storytelling to communicate complex policy topics in an accessible way. So that was really cool to see. So there's a different range that policy or science policy is going towards now, using the new media. So definitely would check that out. And then the last experience I do want to highlight is the Scientist Network for Advancing Policy, specifically the congressional district visits. I came across the opportunity again on LinkedIn after seeing a post shared by a friend and decided to participate. I would definitely encourage others to look into SNAP because it provides a direct way for scientists to engage with policymakers and communicate research related concerns. So through this program, again, I met or went to the physical location of the legislative staff and talked to them about, my talking points like increase biomedical research, and talk about how much funding New Mexico receives through these research grants and because of the federal cuts that have been happening, like how is it being affected? So it wasn't through Zoom anymore, it was actually in person. So it was actually pretty nerve-wracking, but it's a really, really, really great experience that I recommend people trying out or seeing what other stuff that the SNAP does. And then just to touch up on a little bit on because I talked about like being involved in talking to like legislative staff. So there are some like what not to do and like to do's. So for example, like you don't want to use your work or school email just because like you are a constituent, you're not representing the university. You also don't want to use scientific jargon. You want to keep it concise. You don't want to talk politics because you don't know who you're going to be meeting with. So just keeping it neutral and don't underestimate the staff. Like search them up beforehand because you might be meeting with someone who um, is already an expert in that field and you don't want to seem condescending. So just do your homework on them. But some of the things to do is partner with your institution's government relations team because sometimes they do have opportunities to interact um, with Congress or your local districts. You can have those opportunities there. And again, just search for opportunities to meet with your representatives at your home district. Um, this can help build those relationships with them. And also when you're talking to them, you want to keep it simple, especially when it comes to like your research. You don't want to go overboard. But also, again, how I'm saying, like, make sure to look up your representatives and see what areas they are um, targeting or they're interested in because it might be related to your research. For example, like the ones who I have met, they're health specialists. So they cover all health related aspects of it. So I look them up and I just, dig on what their priorities are. And then here, with these experiences and lessons in mind, I do want to share a little bit of how you can get started or get involved or become more involved if you already are. So these are going to be like different levels of commitment. So you have like the more minimal. So that would be like attending workshops or seminars on science policy and advocacy, just sharing your insights informally with peers or like your community. That can be even just doing a journal club or meeting with your friends on a Friday morning and talking about what you guys are interested in. Or you can follow professional societies, advocacy organizations, or policy networks. Or you can also stay informed through newsletters, podcasts, or social media. How I was mentioning, like that's something that's emerging. So TikTok is everywhere, Instagram is everywhere, but also student government or academic clubs. And then more of like the medium level commitment, it's like participating in local or national advocacy days. Um, just because like the participating in local or the national advocacy days, it does kind of take like half a day because either you do it through Zoom or you go in person. So that's, more of a medium level commitment. You can also join advocacy policy committees within professional societies. For example, like where I'm at, like with RSA. Usually you meet monthly, but they still require some type of commitment. But also you can contact your representatives. It will be a little bit more of a time commitment because you want to write a letter and just again do more research on them. And then more on the higher um, commitment would be to like participate in science policy advocacy programs. So just like what I mentioned, like with ECPA, or other like workshops to help you understand and get into them. Also, like drafting policy memos, one pagers, or other science policy materials. Like again, if you don't know what they are, you're gonna have to spend time knowing what goes in, and also like just writing in general will take some time. So it's much more of a higher level commitment. But you can also organize or lead outreach advocacy initiatives at campus or community level. Some universities do have their own policy club, or you might have to develop one. But also another higher one would be like hosting a lab tour. That one takes a full day, but also the planning of it does take a little bit longer. And just here, just some opportunities in science policy and training. Here are just a few that um, again, from what I have been part of, but also some that I know of. There's so many opportunities. If you're in neuroscience and are interested in applying for the SFN ECPA program, feel free to contact me. The NIH has a summer internship, so that's one avenue. If you are part of the American Chemical Society, that's another one. Looking into National Science Policy Network. Again, Scope and the AAAS case workshop. That one's I would definitely recommend. And if you want to like get more into the writing, the Journal of Science, Policy and Governance, they offer volunteer opportunities for editors, and also so you can submit writing opportunities there as well. So skills gained through the advocacy and policy work, like these are already skills that we already have, right? What's like communicating the science, but when you're doing the advocacy and policy work, you're focusing on science communication. So that's like translating neuroscience for policymakers as well as like non-scientists. So it does become a little bit becomes important to like know your audience. Also, connecting policy to like connecting science to policy. So you're using scientific evidence to inform um, policy recommendations in memos and one pagers. So that's something you can do in there or in that sector. You're also actively engaged in advocacy, so that in engaging in workshops, whether that's through congressional visits and advocacy committees. And this highlights the importance, at least for me, it was like highlighting the importance of substance use disorders when I was talking to them. But you can also talk about other things that you're interested in. And also one of the things that I found very beneficial from doing this was the networking and collaboration. So just building the connections with peers, mentors, and professional organizations really did help out because again, it was just networking and it was like, hey, there's this opportunity, and I, just took it. And then alongside these skills and opportunities, I also encountered a few challenges and lessons that shaped how I approached science policy work. For example, balancing research and advocacy/policy efforts. Again, that's why I had mentioned like the level of commitment. So you want to assess that. But I was also transparent with my research mentor. So I brought up that I was interested in it, and we found ways that I was able to balance both of them. And then the science communication, again, just communicating those complex findings clearly was a little bit hard because again, um, we get so bogged down with the details that they just care about the outcome. And then understanding the policy landscape, again, just um different writing styles, and then how scientific evidence informs decision making. And then one of the things that I did encounter, which was kind of hard, was like the limited training opportunities. So what I ended up doing was pursuing experiences outside the university. And then also managing imposter syndrome, because again, how I've said, I felt like I was not qualified for most of the things, but I learned that engagement is possible at any stage. Oops, I'm almost done. Cool. Sorry. And then, yeah, so here are just, so when we think about the next steps, there are a number of science policy fellowships that offer opportunities to continue this type of work after the PhD. So there's state level fellowships and federal level fellowships that are 1 to 2 years. So here's just some examples of them. And then to close off, these are the experiences and pathways ultimately that connect to the careers in science policy. So it takes in many different forms. So research and policy, you can do health policy analysis, work for the Senate and House, do science communication, organize programs, um, policy director slash assistant policy director, or just data gathering. But you would be working with like nonprofits or like think tanks. But with that, I am finished. Thank you. And if anyone has any questions or comments, I am more than happy to take them.
Thank you so much. So to all of our attendees, we are at time. If you have to go, feel free. You're under no obligation to stay, and you know that the recording will be posted for you later today. So you can tap in if you are interested in seeing some of the questions that get raised. That being said, if you do want to stay, you do have some questions, we can stay for another 5 to 10 minutes, depending, and we'll try to get some of your questions answered. Thank you again for everyone who attended, and thank you so much, Monserrat, for a wonderful presentation. So many opportunities that that make your head spin. So feel free to write in the chat or in the Q&A if you have any questions. Montserrat, maybe you would want to go to your slide 23 with the fellowships, or slide 20 with some opportunities. Uh, you know, if anybody has a specific question about one of these. We do have one question coming in right now from Diana, who says, "How do you balance performing science and science policy work even after graduate school?"
Sorry, so can you repeat the question one more time?
So how do you balance performing, doing your science work and then
Mhm.
also doing the science policy work? And what might that look like after graduate school?
Yeah, so as a trainee, again, I can speak from like the trainee perspective, but I can also talk about what I've seen with some colleagues who are doing like fellowships and policy work. So from the trainee perspective and where I'm at right now, I'm not gonna lie, it was a little bit difficult at the beginning because again, it was like the learning experience of it. But then again, when I was like being transparent with my research mentor, we found ways to balance that out. So I was very interested in, again, like addiction. So it's like relating it back to my research. So I know I talked about a lot of like the opioid use disorder incarcerated population, but I have shifted over to like alcohol research. So doing more advocacy and doing more science policy within um, the research that I'm doing, so I can balance that better and continue to talk about the alcohol research. And that's why I applied to the society's advocacy program because I'm actively doing that and also relates back to my work, like funding, more funding for alcohol because of the whole NIDA and NIAAA merging. So it's just trying to advocate and come up with policies where that wouldn't happen. So that was a little bit more directly to what I'm doing now. Now, in the context of like graduation, if you do more like the policy, I think I'm still sharing my screen.
You are.
But like yeah, so like the policies, these are specifically more for like when you're done with your PhD. So all you will be doing is you're gonna either if you do it at the state level, you will be focused on state level issues Whereas like in the federal, you can be placed in the executive, legislative, or judicial branch to continue to be doing policy work and monitoring wherever you're placed. You can also be placed, from my understanding, is for example, in societies as well. I think this was a newer last year. I forgot the program and what it's called, but they were trying to put also scientists in industry to do that type of science policy. So now you're more involved in the policy and how research is being done rather than being in the lab.
Great, thank you. I think we'll just give another 2 minutes to see if any other questions pop up. And so 2 more minutes if you have any burning questions.
I'm happy to answer any question, or if anyone wants to email me with questions, I am more than happy to answer them via email too.
Okay, great. There you have your email there and also a QR code for your LinkedIn. So
Yeah.
it's really nice. We have a question from Luis Gonzalez. It says, how can universities develop and implement science policy initiatives that increase public scientific literacy?
That is a good question. Because sometimes, so that's why I had said or I mentioned like partnering or like seeking opportunities or like reaching out with your government relations. Um, I guess group or it's actually like I'm blanking on the word. Um, so it's like the government affairs office. So that's where they represent the university and help, like for example, like students. And for example, if you want to do like any policy related type of stuff, like you can run it with them. Um, so that's what I would recommend, going with the government affairs or relations team with that. But if you're talking about in the context of like how university can be more supportive in this science policy sector, I think it's just the community. Because I think also if that's what I had to learn, right? You cannot represent the university because in you're not in that position to do that. Only like the dean or like the president of the university can represent the university. So you have to like separate that with being a constituent. And that's why like going with your government relations office is really helpful to like navigate that. But again, in the context of like just having that community and talking about your experiences at the university as a constituent, not representing the university, um, it's it's helpful that way just to have that community. I hope that answered your question, Luis.
Yeah, I think that's really important to know. You know, that's not something that I knew at one point, but yeah, the
Yeah, because you
universities
can.
typically have.
hmm Yeah, so at least even like for example from like my experiences, like I make it very clear that I am a constituent and I'm representing myself, not the university. Because one thing I was gonna say is like you can also, for example, like reach out to the president about concerns that you're having, right? For example, like the whole funding cuts of last year was like everyone was messaging like their president of the school and everything, right? So that was like a form of advocacy and just saying like, hey, this is what we're going through. If you're not aware, like, can you implement some certain policies or um, like advocate for us at the state and federal level, or having them talk to the legislative staff in New Mexico or your state, and then having them advocate at the federal level.
All right. Well, thank you again, Monse, for the amazing presentation and all this wonderful information. Thank you to those of you who are still here for sticking around, and I hope you gained a lot from this webinar. And I hope everyone has a great day.